Becky had always prided herself on having the most pristine front yard on Maple Street. Every Wednesday morning, she'd roll out of bed, slip on her purple gardening gloves, and tackle an ever-expanding row of rose bushes with a pair of pruning shears. Yet it wasn't the roses that had earned her renown, but the vivid collection of garden gnomes perched in whimsical poses around her lawn. Over time, she had amassed no fewer than 16 of the pointy-hatted figures, some with fishing rods, others astride ceramic snails, a few hoisting tiny lanterns. She greeted each of them with soft conversation, fully believing in the unspoken code of horticultural courtesy. Talk to your roses, talk to your gnomes, offer encouragement to the soil itself, and everything would flourish. Neighbors would often poke their heads over the picket fence and remark on how charming the gnomes looked nestled among the flower beds. Becky basked in the praise but never revealed just how deeply she adored her little ceramic guardians. There was just something so comforting about opening her curtains in the early morning light and seeing their hand-painted faces. With each new addition, she believed her garden grew happier, more vibrant, and decidedly more magical. But when she woke up on a sun-scorched Thursday in August, she heard a tune, an impossibly catchy melody, emanating from somewhere near her hydrangea bushes. Half asleep, she stumbled across the yard, still in her polka-dot pajamas, wondering if she had left some portable radio behind. Instead of a radio, she discovered a group of gnomes in a circle, knees bent, arms raised, dancing in perfect time to music that seemed to come from nowhere. Becky dropped her watering can with a clang. "Good heavens," she whispered, "I must be dreaming." She rubbed her eyes and pinched her arm in the hopes of snapping back to reality. Yet the gnomes kept on dancing. Just a day earlier, she would have insisted such a thing were impossible. Gnomes were ceramic, lifeless. They shouldn't be able to bob and sway. She leaned toward them in befuddlement, and that was when she noticed a tiny winged creature perched atop a toadstool, giggling with mischievous delight. Becky blinked. A fairy? Over the years, she had insisted to her friends that if fairies existed, they'd surely make an appearance in her garden, but she'd never truly expected to see one fluttering between the geraniums. The fairy was no taller than Becky's pinky finger, dressed in a shimmering purple gown, with glittering dust floating behind. The tiny being caught Becky watching and gave a cheerful wave before zipping across the yard, out of sight. The music stopped. The gnomes froze in mid-sway. Becky stood there, mouth agape, the watering can lying on its side, water trickling into the grass. She couldn't deny what she had just seen. Her gnomes, brought to life by a fairy. Something told her this was only the beginning. Yet true to her hunch, the gnome transformations continued. The next afternoon, as she was weeding near her petunias, she heard a chorus of laughter echo from behind a row of daisies. She parted the flower stalks just in time to witness a pair of gnomes, one with a bright green hat, another with a chipped red hat, doing an enthusiastic tap dance routine. The mischievous fairy flitted around them, clapping and humming a jazzy beat. That night, Becky couldn't sleep for the sound of teeny-tiny tap shoes echoing all the way to her bedroom window. She groaned, wishing she had invested in thicker curtains. Though initially bemused, Becky soon realized the dancing whimsy was creating chaos in the neighborhood. The once still gnomes would wander into neighbors' yards, conga line across sidewalks, or sneak onto patios to pirouette under porch lights. Mrs. Marsh from next door nearly toppled over her recycling bin when a waltzing gnome spooked her at 5 in the morning. Mr. Flanders down the block filed a complaint to the Homeowners Association about strange yard disturbances, which only fueled local gossip. Becky spent her days trying to herd the gnomes back to her property, attempting to mimic the fairies' music so they'd follow her like the Pied Piper, but they never stayed put for long. "I'm not mad at you," she told the fairy one late afternoon when she finally caught her perched on the rim of the birdbath, "but could you please turn them back? My neighbors are getting suspicious and I can't be chasing tiny dancers all day." The fairy hovered in the air, silver wings flitting. "But it's so much fun," she chirped, her voice high and melodious. "They look so bored stiff in those poses. It's tragic, really." Before Becky could argue, The fairy sprinkled a handful of shimmering dust towards two nearby gnomes shaped like miniature farmers. At once, they sprang to life, hoed an invisible patch of soil, and then broke into a line dance. See? The fairy squealed, twirling mid-air. They're so much happier. Uncertain how to convince the fairy of the havoc she was causing, Becky merely groaned as the tiny being zoomed away. She berated herself for not seizing the chance to demand a reversal right then and there. But the fairy's attention span was fleeting, and even Becky had to admit something was kind of charming about those ceramic faces lighting up in joyous expression. At least that was how she felt, until the next wave of trouble arrived. Within a week, folks throughout Maple Street had begun witnessing bizarre events, all traced back to Becky's sprightly gnome crew. The local diner staff reported seeing a trio of pointy-headed troublemakers boogieing atop a dumpster out back. Miss Huang, who taught yoga in her backyard every morning, found her sessions interrupted by a crowd of gnomes doing interpretive dance poses next to her mat. At the library, two gnomes were caught scurrying through the double doors, apparently having used a child's forgotten library card to license themselves for entry. The rumor was they were in pursuit of new music CDs. While some residents found the spectacle amusing, others grew disgruntled by the mania. A dancing gnome or two might be cute, but a dozen? Tumbling through the community fountain while traffic stalled for passing conga lines, enough was enough. Even Becky's steadfast fans' neighbors who adored her rose bushes approached her with cautious smiles. So, about the dancing gnomes, they'd start uncertain how to phrase their concerns. And Becky, racked with guilt, would promise them she was on top of the situation. Truth be told, she had no plan. Dealing with a roguish fairy wasn't covered in any gardener's manual. She tried stockings around the gnomes at night, bundling them in fabric so they couldn't move. But every morning she'd find those linens shredded and the garden ornaments doing tango routines. Trying earplugs? That only helped her sleep and did nothing to keep the gnomes in check. Desperate, Becky joined every nature forum she could find, seeking advice on controlling fairies. A few suggested drastic measures, like sprinkling salt or iron shavings along the perimeter to ward off magical creatures. But Becky found the idea too harsh. She disliked the notion of harming or banishing a fairy, especially one who, at her core, was just having fun. Maybe I can talk sense into her, Becky told herself. Just gotta catch her at the right moment. That right moment came one early evening, just after Becky finished yet another Chase the Gnomes, had formed a conga line halfway up the block before she corralled them home. She noticed a glow beneath her sprawling oak tree. There was the fairy, apparently practicing some new magical incantation. Her wings sparkled in the last beams of sunlight. Becky approached softly, clearing her throat. "Sorry to bother you." The fairy turned. "Oh, you found me. You humans can be so quiet sometimes." Becky tried to keep a friendly tone. "I know you're just having fun, but the dancing gnomes are maybe too successful. People are complaining. Is there any way you could just dial back the magic a bit? Maybe not revert them all to statues, but let them, go back to being typical garden ornaments, or at least a little less mobile. They're causing trouble all over town." The fairy pursed her lips in a pouty expression. "I thought you liked them." "I do," Becky insisted, "but at least let me moderate the partying. I can't keep chasing them at all hours." For a moment, the fairy looked regretful. She flitted closer to Becky's shoulder. "Oh dear, I had no idea it was upsetting you. I only do it because it's my way of saying hello to the world. I love parties, and you love your gnomes. Don't you want them to have a good time too?" In that moment, Becky wavered. She recognized that maybe life could be more fun if you allowed a little silliness, a bit of music under the moon and stars. Still, there had to be a balance. "Partying is great," she said gently, "but not at the cost of everyone's peace. Maybe we can find a compromise? Keep a small group animated sometimes, like once a week, and let the others stay statues?" The fairy's eyes brightened. "A weekly gnome dance party? Ooh, that could work." She spun in the air, sprinkling shimmering dust all around as she celebrated the idea. A single magical night every week for your garden. I love it. Thrilled that the fairy was at least open to negotiation, Becky grinned. Could you do me one more favor? Turn all the stray gnomes, which is basically all of them, into statues for now. I've got an HOA meeting soon, and I want them to see the yard is back to normal. The fairy nodded. If that's what you want, friend Becky. With that, she began to swirl, summoning a gust of sparkling wind. Becky shielded her eyes from the iridescent swirl of magical dust. Then, as quickly as it had begun, silence settled on the night air. The music vanished. Opening her eyes, Becky saw her gnomes linked in a neat row, motionless once again. She nearly teared up with relief. Even though the immediate chaos had subsided, Becky felt uneasy. She had negotiated a weekly dance party, yes, but she had no idea how that would play out. Over the next few days, she went about normal life, mowing the lawn, watering her garden, greeting neighbors who peered suspiciously at her yard. At the monthly homeowners association meeting, neighbors brought up the dancing gnome fiasco, demanding Becky explain herself. She decided, in a moment of strategic half-truth, to blame it on misguided animatronics. She claimed she tinkered with a fancy mechanical gnome experiment that malfunctioned, causing them to wander around. Some neighbors seemed unconvinced, but at least it was a plausible explanation that prevented talk of supernatural occurrences. That same evening, Becky found herself once again searching her garden for the fairy. After an hour of fruitless scanning, she sank onto her patio's wicker chair, sipping lemonade in the dim glow of a lantern. Maybe the fairy left. Maybe her job was done. Yet the quiet felt unnatural, even stifling. She found herself missing the twinkling laughter and the swirling dust. Just as she was about to head inside, she spotted the fairy peeking from behind a basil plant. "Are you ready for the big event?" the fairy asked in a hushed voice. "Big event?" Becky echoed. "I thought we agreed on just a small weekly party." "Sure," the fairy answered, spinning once the way a child might. "But it's going to be so spectacular that I invited a few friends." She extended her arms wide, as though awaiting applause. A chill traveled up Becky's spine. "Friends? You mean other fairies?" The fairy shook her head. "Well, some are fairies, a few are woodland sprites, a couple are tiny elves, and there might even be a reluctant pixie or two. It's not a real party without a guest list, right?" Becky nearly choked on her lemonade. She recalled those nature forum posts that mentioned how quickly magical gatherings could get out of hand. "I'm not sure we can handle that many magical beings." "Don't worry," the fairy reassured, patting Becky's finger gently. "We'll all be on our best behavior, more or less." When the night of the scheduled dance party arrived, Becky prepared as though she were hosting a festival. She composted the garden beds, arranged the gnomes in a neat semicircle, and set out a string of twinkling lights so her yard sparkled. She even provided a modest snack tray, tiny crackers, a small dish of honey, a few apple slices, on a hunch that fairies might like sweet treats. Around dusk, sure enough, glowing figures began appearing among her flowers like fireflies. Becky soon spotted the original mischievous fairy leading the pack. Then came a pair of elves, no taller than a soda can, each carrying little fiddles. A gaggle of sprites flew in next, trailing glimmering dust. They circled overhead, chattering in hushed melodic tones. Within minutes, the gnomes began to stir. The red-hatted fisherman stood straight, fishing pole clutched in one hand as his feet began to shuffle from side to side. The gnome riding the snail hopped off his mount and immediately attempted a hip-hop routine. The entire congregation of pointy-hatted figures fanned out, limbs loosening, eyes blinking with renewed life. Becky marveled at the spectacle. It was like some grand dream had taken over her garden, weaving tiny magical shapes into a rhythmic tapestry. Music drifted through the air, though she couldn't pinpoint its source. It sounded like wind chimes, tinged with the light strumming of a mandolin. She tried to remain calm, reminding herself how chaotic things had been before, but the scene unfolding was a gentler, more orchestrated dance than the random street antics of last week. The fairy, with her sparkling wings, hovered above like a tiny maestro, guiding the tempo. The elves played their fiddles, the sprites sang in harmony, and the gnomes, for their part, danced without running off at full speed. Instead, they formed a circle, and as the music soared, each gnome performed a little flourish, a pirouette, a jig, even a spirited can-can. "I can't believe this is happening," muttered Becky, equal parts astonished and enchanted. She tiptoed across the grass, careful not to step on any smaller guests. She caught sight of a pixie perched atop a lawn flamingo, bopping her head to the music. She also spied a few fairies nibbling the honey-slicked crackers, licking their lips in delight. For the briefest moment, Becky forgot all her earlier worries. This was a little slice of magic in her very own front yard, the sort of wonder people read about in fairy tales but rarely experience firsthand. Then her neighbor's porch light snapped on. Becky's heart seized up. The circle of gnomes paused mid-dance. The music faltered. Her neighbors might see the spectacle. She crouched behind her daisies, trying to assess the situation. It was Mrs. Marsh again, rummaging through her recycling bin. The woman stopped, looking in Becky's direction. Becky braced herself, half expecting a horrified scream about the swirling illusions prancing around the yard. To Becky's shock, Mrs. Marsh merely yawned, picked up a stray soda can, and shuffled back into her house. It appeared that, from Mrs. Marsh's vantage point, the swirling forms and glimmering lights were hidden behind dense foliage. Relieved, Becky darted back into the open. She exhaled a pent-up breath and gestured to the musicians to continue. One of the elves gave a comical shrug, raised his fiddle bow, and the music resumed. The dance party was back on. What surprised Becky most was how quickly the hours passed. From a faint sunset glow to a deep blue midnight sky, she watched the mesmerizing spectacle of shimmering lights and swirling dancers. The fairy had indeed kept her word. No rowdy mischief spilled over into the streets. The gnomes stayed mostly contained to Becky's property, with only a couple of them wandering near the hedges. Occasionally, a few elves would stray, checking out Becky's porch rocking chair or the small stepping stones to the backyard, but they always returned to the music. At around 12:30, the fairy beckoned Becky to join the celebration. "You're the host," she insisted, bobbing in the air. "At least dance for one song." Feeling silly, Becky set aside her skepticism. She placed one foot on the grass, the other step following, and she began to sway. The gnomes encouraged her with their toothy grins, and soon enough, Becky found herself whirling among them, mindful not to topple the little dancers. Laughter bubbled in her chest. She couldn't remember the last time she felt so unexpectedly carefree. A swirl of silver dust caught her attention, a new arrival. Becky watched a solemn presence drift into her garden. This figure was taller than the fairies, maybe a foot high, but possessed the same gossamer wings. She was draped in a robe of glowing petals that changed color with every movement. A hush rippled through the crowd. This was not some carefree sprite. She radiated an air of authority, like an elder or perhaps a queen of sorts. The mischievous fairy zipped over to greet the newcomer. Their conversation was hushed, but Becky caught the gist. This elder fairy was not entirely pleased at the sight of gnomes turned mobile. Becky's stomach knotted as she imagined being scolded for hosting such an event. She tiptoed closer, ears perked, hoping to glean the conversation. "I told you," the elder fairy said, her voice resonating sweetly but firmly. "We must not meddle too much in the human world. It creates imbalance." "But they weren't hurting anyone," the mischievous fairy insisted. "We're just having fun." "And that is where the danger lies," the elder replied, her tone softening. "Too often our magic entices us to indulge in ongoing amusement without regard for consequence. Look at the trouble these gnomes caused. Humans and fairies must keep some boundaries." Becky realized then that she might have to intervene. She cleared her throat gently. Immediately, both fairies turned to her. She mustered her courage to speak. "I appreciate the magic you brought here," Becky said. "Truly, it has been wonderful in many ways. But I also see that it's caused confusion and stress for my neighbors. So, I understand your concern." She addressed the elder fairy directly. "We want to keep peace, but maybe we can allow for a small dose of this enchantment every once in a while? Like a scheduled event, so it doesn't lead to chaos?" The elder fairy's violet eyes flickered, taking Becky's measure. "You speak with caution, human. It is unusual to find one so open-minded yet respectful of boundaries. My concern is that this merriment, repeated too frequently, will breach the delicate veil between our worlds." The mischievous fairy piped up. "But Becky said we can do a weekly party." She flung some dust in excitement. The elder fairy frowned, shaking her head. Weekly is too often. The veil would grow thin, and we risk exposing ourselves to many more humans. At that moment, Becky's eyes darted to the gnomes still dancing in a circle, seemingly oblivious to the tension. The sweet tune from the elves' fiddles lingered in the air. She wanted the magic, but not at the cost of unleashing unstoppable mischief or revealing fairies to an entire suburban street. What if we do it just once a month, she found herself proposing. One night a month, the gnomes come alive and celebrate. I'll prepare the garden in a way that keeps them from wandering off, and I can make sure the neighbors stay unaware, block the view, or keep the lights off. That way nobody panics, and you guys can still have your fun. The elder fairy studied Becky's face. After a thoughtful pause, she nodded. That might be acceptable. The distance between human skepticism and fairy secrecy is maintained, and it still allows us a bit of revelry. But, she added, turning to the mischievous fairy, you must promise to keep it contained. Becky's new fairy friend saluted with an enthusiastic grin. We'll be as secretive as shadows, promise? By the time the clock struck 1, the gathering began winding down. The elves packed up their fiddles, the sprites yawned and rubbed their eyes, and the gnomes slowed their dancing to a gentle sway. One by one, magical guests drifted away into the night, leaving behind a faint glitter in the air. The elder fairy bade Becky a courteous farewell, whispering a soft thanks for her kindness before vanishing in a shimmer of light. Surveying the clearing, Becky realized how quiet it suddenly felt without the music and giggles. Only the mischievous fairy lingered. She fluttered near Becky's shoulder and set down a tiny bag of sparkling dust on the wicker table. A token for you, she explained, just in case you need to do some small everyday magic like helping your flowers grow or your bread to rise. But be careful, even a pinch of fairy dust can do surprising things. Becky's face lit up. She picked up the little bag with great reverence, weighing it in her hand. Thank you. That's beyond generous, the fairy shrugged playfully. You've given me permission for a monthly soiree. That is worth quite a bit. Besides, I like you, Becky. Any human who welcomes dancing gnomes into her life is a friend of mine. Then, with a playful bow, the fairy zoomed off, leaving a cascading trail of iridescent sparks behind her. Becky stood there, enthralled, a grin spreading from ear to ear. She glanced at the now still gnomes, each frozen in its final pose. They would remain that way until next month's gathering, when once again the hush of night would be disrupted by fairy music and twinkling lights. The next morning, Becky awoke feeling as though she had attended a masquerade ball in a dream. Yet reminders of the event remained everywhere. Tiny footprints in the soil where elves had danced, smudges of glitter dust on the stepping stones, and a faint hum inside her mind from the enchanting tunes. As she wandered the yard, she inspected each gnome to ensure they were back in place. They looked ordinary enough, but Becky could sense a vibrant undercurrent of magic waiting beneath their painted surfaces, like a pulse of energy swirling around them. Feeling a surge of optimism, she tackled her usual gardening tasks. Her rose bushes, if it were possible, looked even more radiant than before, almost as if they had fed on the fairy dust swirling in the air. Becky caught herself humming one of the tunes from the night before. She tried spritzing a pinch of that dust on her tomatoes, and sure enough, they started growing plump before her very eyes. She gasped in delight, then quickly brushed away any lingering glitter so as not to overdo it and end up with tomato vines climbing onto the roof. Though she worried her neighbors might still be on high alert, the day passed uneventfully. No gnome breakouts, no conga lines, no panicked phone calls. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Marsh even commented on how calm everything seemed. Becky just smiled and nodded. She almost wished she could share the truth, that her lawn had served as a stage for a magical gala only hours before. But some secrets, she realized, were best kept in the realm of wonder. In the weeks that followed, Becky noticed a subtle shift in herself. She became more patient, more open to the whimsical side of life. Where before she might have fussed endlessly over every fallen leaf, she now took moments to appreciate the shapes made by sunlight filtering through branches. She played quiet music in the evenings and found the small joys in it, imagining the gnomes longing to dance, but maintaining their composure until the appointed night. The fairy didn't appear again, at least not visibly, yet Becky occasionally glimpsed a bright flicker among the flowers and sensed that her magical friend was still around, biding her time until the next visit. She tidied up her yard with a renewed sense of anticipation. She put up a small wooden sign tucked behind her rose bush that read, "Gnome Gathering by Invitation," hoping the fairy might find it amusing. When the final Friday of the month arrived, Becky stayed up late once more, a silent excitement coursing through her. She draped a sheer curtain over her porch so that any passers-by wouldn't catch the dancing lights. She prepared a new tray of sweet treats, and sure enough, as midnight approached, a swirl of glittering shapes shimmered into being beneath the moonlight. The gnomes stretched their ceramic arms, loosening magically reawakened limbs. Soft music began again, the tune just as enchanting as before. This time, Becky found herself less fearful, more eager. She joined in the dancing from the outset, swirling among the fluttering fairies and lively gnomes, letting the music fill her with the purest laughter. The party didn't spiral into chaos. No neighbors woke in a panic. No gnome lines extended to the street. It was simply a night of wonder shared among Becky, her fairy friend, and a carefully chosen few magical creatures. Somehow, the hush was just as exhilarating as any carnival parade, maybe even more so because it was their secret, a hidden gem tucked away in an unassuming suburban yard. At around 1 in the morning, the elder fairy appeared again, gave a short nod of approval, and cast a protective glow around the property. She and Becky exchanged smiles, silently acknowledging that boundaries were being respected without fully snuffing out the fairy's livelihood. The mischievous fairy noticed Becky eyeing her, flitted over, and giggled. "See?" she teased. "Told you we could behave." "You did," Becky replied, tapping her foot gently. "And I'm glad. This is magical without being a nuisance." The fairy spread her arms and spun. "We still know how to have fun, but now it's an organized fun. If only humans could manage that balance in their own parties." Becky laughed, shaking her head at the irony. "You're not wrong. This might be less rowdy than my cousin's wedding last year." As the clock crept toward 2, Becky felt a delicious fatigue setting in. The music began to slow. Gnomes wound down their steps, returning to their original perches. The elves packed up their fiddles, and the sprites offered hushed goodbyes. A final sprinkle of dust danced through the late summer air, glowing like golden fireflies. One by one, the magical visitors vanished into the shadows or soared off beneath the starry sky, leaving Becky's garden as still as if the entire spectacle had never taken place. Yet Becky knew better. It was a sweet secret she kept close, preserving just enough evidence in the form of a stray footprint or an errant piece of glitter that clung to a leaf in the rose bush. Before she drifted off to bed, Becky paused to gaze at her yard under the soft porch light. Hers was a house like any other on Maple Street. A small patch of grass, a few flowers, a bed of mulch. But hidden beneath that ordinary exterior was a realm of possibility. A space shared with extraordinary friends, tiptoeing the line between worlds. Becky smiled, hugging the memory of dancing gnomes to her heart. Just as she refused to let her delicate rose petals wilt under scorching sun, she would protect this magic with careful, tender devotion. From that night on, once every month, a hush would fall across Maple Street at midnight. But in Becky's yard, the hush carried an undercurrent of anticipation. Within moments, tiny whimsical tunes floated on the breeze, fairy lights glimmered, and a parade of gnomes came alive, stepping in unison for their monthly celebration, a secret dance party bridging the worlds of humans and fairies. And if Becky sometimes heard her neighbors comment on fleeting shadows or glimpsed neighbors turning their heads at a faint flicker of colored light, she smiled and shrugged. After all, some mysteries were worth preserving, especially those that made life just a little more magical, like a handful of garden gnomes that came to life under a mischievous fairy's spell.